I always thought that the most dangerous noise in my house was the creaking of the back door on windy nights. It was the kind of sound that reminded me how old and alone I was in that big house that has seen better days. That morning, however, it was the sharp ringing of the phone that cut the air and changed everything. I had the kettle on the fire, waiting for the tea whistle, when the insistent ringing began to bother me. I still didn't know that, along with that sound, there was also the news that my own son wanted to declare me incapable. I answered the phone with a damp hand from washing the dishes, drying on the hem of the flowered apron that has already lost its colors. On the other side, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice, cold as if she were calling any service. "Hi, Helen, I just called to let you know that Daniel's lawyer is going to be there today," she said, without even asking how I was. My heart jumped a little, because no one sends a lawyer to an old woman's house for nothing. I tried to laugh, disguising my fear, and asked why, but the answer came like a punch in the stomach. "It's about the interdiction process, Helen, it's the best for everyone," she said, as if talking about a roof repair. For a few seconds I only heard the silence itself, as if the world had gone deaf along with me. I felt the floor move away from my feet, and I had to lean on the bench to keep from slipping. I had never been called incapable, at least not with such a heavy, official word. At that moment, I realized that the fear I had of being alone was less painful than being discarded by my own child. I tried to understand, asked for explanations, asked if Daniel knew about that call. On the other side, she sighed, impatient, as if I were a child asking too many questions. "He only wants the best for you, you are forgetful, confused, it's dangerous to be alone," she said, pushing on me a fragility that I didn't recognize. I immediately remembered the times when Daniel corrected my small lapses in front of others, laughing, calling me an absent-minded old woman. Now I saw that maybe it wasn't a joke at all. After I hung up, I stood in the middle of the kitchen, with the phone still in my hand. The kettle's whistle finally exploded, shrill, but I didn't have the courage to turn it off. It was as if that sound kept company with the noise of my head spinning, trying to put the pieces together. Was I really that bad and didn't realize it, or was someone taking advantage of my age? There, with the steam rising and fogging up the window, I felt that something very wrong had been set in motion. I walked into the living room, looking at every piece of furniture, every photograph on the walls, as if I were saying goodbye to them. On the coffee table, the photo of Daniel as a child, still with crooked teeth, smiling at me as if I were his world. I remembered the nights I stayed up waiting for him to get home from college, the fear I had that he would get bad company. I never imagined that, so many years later, it would be from him that I would need to protect myself. And that idea went through me like a slow knife. I sat in the creaking armchair, my faithful companion of sleepless nights. I ran my hand over the arms of the chair, feeling the smooth wood marked by the years and by my own hand. If I lost that house, it wouldn't just be a roof and four walls going away, it would be my whole story. And now my own son seemed willing to wrest it from me, using a pen, a stamp, and the excuse of taking care of me. I looked at the wall clock, the one that is always 5 minutes late but never fails to remind me of time. The lawyer would arrive in a few hours, and I still didn't know how to prepare for it. I had no training to deal with laws, lawsuits, or fancy words used to cover up dirty intentions. What I had was only my memory, my judgment, and an uncomfortable feeling of being betrayed. And for the first time in my life, I began to doubt whether that would be enough. I took an old notebook and started writing things down, as if I were studying for a test. I wrote down dates, medicines I took, chores I had done that week, names of neighbors I spoke to. I wanted to prove to myself that I was still capable of remembering, organizing, being logical. Each line written was a small act of resistance against the confused old lady image they were painting of me. When I finished, my hands trembled, but it wasn't because of age, it was because of anger. That late morning, as the sun came through the living room window and drew rectangles of light on the worn carpet, I made a decision. I could be old, tired, and with some forgetfulness, but I was still the owner of MIM.se. Daniel wanted to snatch me from this house. He would have to do it looking right into my eyes. And if a lawyer was coming, then I would also use that to my advantage, even though I didn't know how yet. I just didn't imagine that, along with him, would also come the key to a past that I had never understood well. If you're feeling the tension building along with Helen, subscribe now to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this exciting story. I spent the rest of the day as someone who tidies up the house for a visitor he doesn't want to receive. I adjusted cushions, cleaned the desk, organized papers, all in an attempt to keep my hands busy. The clock seemed to mock me, pushing the minutes too slowly, making the suspense stretch. When I finally heard the car parking in front of my house, my heart raced more than I care to admit. I went to the door with firm steps, forcing my legs not to betray the fear. He got out of the car with a dark leather briefcase under his arm, a suit too neat for such a simple street. He had the trained smile of someone who is already used to giving bad news in a calm voice. "Donna Helen? I'm Dr. Collins, your son's lawyer, he said, extending his hand as if we were at a welcome tea. I squeezed his hand tightly, wanting to show that my joints were still working. I invited him in, already smelling the smell of paper and pen ink that seemed to spread across the room. We sat at the kitchen table, because I never liked serious conversations in the living room. Serious conversation I face where I make coffee, where I rule and rule, where I have always owned my own territory. He opened the briefcase, pulling out a bunch of documents that he carefully scattered in front of us. He spoke of family concern, protection measures, well-being in old age. Every word was coated with kindness, but it hit my ears as an accusation. I let him speak, because sometimes silence makes people reveal more than they should. While he explained the interdiction process in technical terms, I watched his eyes, his hands, the way he breathed. When she mentioned that Daniel feared that I might hurt myself, something in me turned around. I remembered how many times I was the one who took care of my son's cuts, fevers and falls, without ever thinking about hospitalizing him. That's when I decided to cut his rehearsed speech. "Doctor, tell me something, who is really scared here, my son or you?" I asked, looking directly at him. He gasped for a second, not expecting resistance from a lady in a flowered apron. "I understand that you may feel attacked," she replied, slipping into a professional neutrality that did not convince me. But at that moment, I noticed something different, a small, white, sealed envelope that he took out of his briefcase and left separate from the other papers. The gesture was quick, almost automatic, as if he already knew that that envelope had a certain destination. He kept talking, but my attention went entirely to that envelope. It had no name written on it, no stamp, just a firm letter in the corner, Mrs. Miller. Daniel Miller, my son, the same one who at that moment called me incapable through someone else's mouth. When the lawyer began to collect papers, the envelope ended up right on top of the pile intended for me. "These are the documents for you to read calmly and sign later, if you agree," he said, pushing the small mound towards me. The envelope came along, like a stowaway in the wrong suitcase. I felt a twinge in my belly, the kind we feel when we know we found something we shouldn't. But I kept the expression of a polite old woman, just nodding my head and thanking her for the attention. He didn't notice anything, or pretended not to, which was the same. Before leaving, he still asked if I had someone who could accompany me in reading the documents. I replied that I always had someone by my side, myself, and that brought me to 71 years of age alive and standing. He smiled, a little uncomfortable, as if I was being too witty for a supposedly incapable. He accompanied himself to the door, shook my hand again, wished me a good morning that sounded more like a good luck. When his car turned the corner, the street became silent again, but my mind did not. I closed the door carefully, as if the sound might call someone back and interrupt what I was about to do. I took the papers and the envelope to the living room table, moving away from the magazines, the vase with dried flowers, the television remote. The envelope seemed to weigh more than the paper could hold, as if it carried lead instead of paint. I ran my finger along the glued flap, feeling the rough texture, as if I was about to violate a family secret. For a few seconds, I thought about leaving everything there, untouched, but something inside me didn't accept that idea. I took a deep breath, pulled up my chair and sat down as if preparing to hear a truth cruel with calm care. I opened the envelope, tearing the edge in a dry sound that echoed through the silent house. Inside, folded with almost obsessive precision, were several sheets yellowed by time. The first paragraph I read began with the words, "I need to confess what happened that night." At that very moment, I understood that the lawyer had made a mistake, and that, for the first time in a long time, that mistake was on my side. When I finished reading the first line of that document, I felt the air fade for a moment. The hand that held the sheet became heavy, as if age had suddenly folded over me. The words were crooked, written in a hurry, but they carried a gravity that I pressed to my chest as if they were my own. There, before my eyes, was the beginning of a confession that no one should have ever seen. Each sentence felt like a stone thrown into the bottom of a well I thought I knew. The author spoke of a silent night, of hurried steps, of an accident that perhaps was not an accident. My husband's name appeared, followed by a line, as if someone had hesitated before writing the rest. My heart began to beat so hard that I feared the sound would echo through the empty house. I kept reading, even though my hands insisted on shaking. The confession mentioned a young man, very young, involved in something that ended in death. A death that, according to the letter, had been covered up to protect an entire family. A family of which I was a part. That's when I recognized a name that made me lose my breath, Daniel. My Daniel. For a moment, I closed my eyes, trying to organize the thoughts that were swarming inside my head. My son? Involved in something so serious? It was impossible. He was just a teenager at that time, still with the same crooked smile in the living room photo. But the letter didn't lie to me. Or maybe I was finally seeing what I'd closed my eyes for years. I pressed the paper to my chest, listening to my breath scrape. It wasn't just about me being interdicted. It was about something that Daniel wanted to hide at any price, including the price of my freedom. The case against me no longer felt like care or concern, it was an urgency. A threat disguised as protection. I tried to keep reading, but when I turned the page, I realized that there was something missing. The last sentence ended abruptly, as if it had been cut off in the middle of the thought. I looked inside the empty envelope, expecting to find the lost sheet, but there was nothing. The confession was incomplete. The part that explained the outcome, the crime, the real involvement of each one was missing. The lack of that page made my stomach turn. That document, as it was, could both prove my sanity and put me at risk. It was like holding a bomb without knowing which wire to cut. I needed to understand everything before I ran to show anyone, before I made any move that might alert Daniel. I rested my head on my hands, taking a deep breath, trying to slow down the whirlwind that dragged me along. I never imagined that, at 71, I would be in the middle of a mystery involving my own family. But here I was, with the truth in my hands, or what was left of it, and the rest of the world ready to call me crazy. I stood up slowly, putting the confession inside a lockable drawer that no one else used. If that paper had waited more than 20 years to be found, I could wait a little longer until I decided what to do. But one thing was clear, I wasn't confused. I was not forgotten. I was being deceived. And maybe for the first time in my life, I was willing to find out why. Night fell fast that day, as if the sky was in a hurry to leave me alone with my thoughts. The whole house seemed to shrink around me, each room holding a memory that now had a new weight. I sat on the edge of the bed, hugging my arms around my body, trying to bring order to the chaos that was brewing inside me like a storm. I thought about my son. In the boy I raised with so much effort, so many sleepless nights, so many conversations at the breakfast table. I tried to remember signs I might have ignored, small gestures, awkward silences, anything that pointed to a hidden shadow. But all I found were memories of love and sacrifice, things a mother never expects to see tarnished. For a moment, I doubted myself. What if the daughter-in-law was right? What if I was exaggerating, misinterpreting everything because of age? I shook my head, pushing away the thought as if scaring away a pesky mosquito. It was exactly this kind of doubt that they wanted to plant in me. And for a second, they almost succeeded. I got out of bed and walked through the dark house, turning on lights as if trying to ward off ghosts. I walked past the room and touched Daniel's picture frame again. Her eyes smiling at me seemed to mock the fragile woman I was becoming. I didn't want to be afraid of my own son. I didn't want to believe that he would be able to destroy me to save his own skin. But the envelope, the confession, the interdiction, everything pointed to that. And to ignore these signs would be to voluntarily condemn myself. When I got to the kitchen, I noticed that my hands were cold. I turned on the faucet and let the hot water run over them, trying to bring back some sense of control. Water has always been my therapy, the constant noise, the heat, the movement. But that night, nothing seemed enough to calm the restlessness that devoured me inside. I sat at the table, staring at the walls as if waiting for them to speak. The truth was too hard to swallow on its own. I needed someone. Someone who didn't see me as fragile, who wasn't involved, who could look at everything clearly. Becca came to mind almost like a whisper, the neighbor always attentive, always kind, always willing to help. I took a deep breath and made a silent decision. I would tell her. Not all at once, but enough so that I wouldn't be walking through this maze alone. Maybe she knew how to deal with documents, with laws, with the practical part of what I didn't even know how to name yet. But more than that, I needed human support. Someone who believed in me. The dawn was already advancing when I finally managed to lie down. Fatigue weighed on my body, but sleep did not come. The incomplete confession repeated itself in my head like a broken song, always coming back to the same point, always leaving questions unanswered. Something was missing, the final piece, the missing link, the whole truth. I closed my eyes, but the thought that stayed with me until dawn was simple and devastating. If Daniel was able to hide this for 20 years, what else would he be able to do now? The next morning, I woke up with the nagging feeling that someone had spent the night watching me. It wasn't paranoia, it was the weight of the secret kept in the locked drawer. As I was making coffee, I heard a light knock on the back door, a familiar sound. It was Becca, always too polite to show up unannounced, but always attentive enough to know when something is wrong in the neighborhood. I opened the door and found that gentle smile that, for some reason, brought me a little calm. She held a basket of fresh bread, saying she had done too much and thought about bringing me. I knew it was a lie. Becca never cooked anything without measuring everything down to the millimeter, but I accepted the gesture as if holding a rope thrown in the middle of the shipwreck. We sat in the kitchen, and for a few minutes I tried to keep the conversation light. I talked about the weather, the plants, the quiet street. But the trembling in my hands betrayed the truth that I had not yet had the courage to say. Becca was watching me with that look that sees more than she should. "Helen, something happened, didn't it?" she asked, her voice low and firm. I sighed deeply, as if giving up fighting the inevitable. I walked over to the locked drawer, pulled out the envelope, and placed it on the table. Becca leaned forward, curious, but without invading my space. I told him everything: the lawyer's visit, the interdiction process, the wrong envelope, the confession in half. As I spoke, she did not interrupt me, she just accompanied me with the watchful eye of someone who knows that this is not the invention of a tired mind. When I finished, she was silent for a few seconds, taking it all in. Then he asked to see the pages. I hesitated for a moment, but handed over the document. Becca read it with an increasingly serious expression, frowning as she noticed the abrupt interruption of the last line. "This is no small thing, Helen. And it's not something for someone who is losing their mind," he said. She said that she had worked years before in a notary's office and recognized, by the type of paper and the handwriting, that it was an old, legitimate document, not something forged to confuse me. Her validation brought me unexpected relief, as if I had finally been able to breathe after hours of being submerged. For the first time since it all began, someone believed in me. Becca then leaned over and held my hands, saying that I wouldn't face this alone. Her firmness contrasted with the fragility that the world insisted on attributing to me. It was as if I had found an ally at the exact moment when the ground began to give way. I didn't know how much she would be willing to get involved, but at that moment, her presence was already a kind of salvation. When she said goodbye, promising to come back at the end of the day to continue talking, I accompanied her to the door with a slightly less heavy heart. Still, as I closed the door, I looked at the confession again. There was still a lot of darkness there. And now that I had shared the secret, there was only one way left: to continue to the end. It was scary to think about, but there was also, hidden beneath all the layers of fear, a spark of strength that I didn't remember existed. Becca returned late in the afternoon, as promised, bringing with her a small briefcase that looked old but neatly organized. He said that, before coming, he had reviewed some old legal registration procedures, trying to understand what kind of document might be missing. That surprised me. I didn't expect her to be so deeply involved at first. We sat down at the table again, like two improvised researchers, with the envelope open between us. Becca spread out the leaves and began to analyze them calmly, running her fingers along the margins, looking for signs of tearing or cutting. I watched her, fascinated by the precision with which she treated that paper, as if it were a relic of incalculable value. And maybe it was. She stopped suddenly and tapped lightly on a corner of the page. "Here," he said, pointing to an almost invisible point. There was a faint mark, as if a leaf had been torn off carefully, but not perfectly. My stomach turned. That meant it wasn't just a page that never existed, it was a page taken down deliberately. The lack of it was not an accident. The idea of someone having manipulated that document made me freeze. This meant that the missing page content could directly incriminate someone who didn't want to take that risk. I immediately thought of Daniel, but I forced myself to keep an open mind. The document was old. Many people could be involved, including people who were no longer alive. Becca then suggested something that surprised me by its boldness. If that confession mentions a specific night and an accident that wasn't an accident, someone must have recorded it somewhere. Newspaper, police station, hospital. I didn't have time to answer, because the idea made my heart race. I myself had never looked for anything, perhaps for fear of finding answers. We followed the dates mentioned on the pages together and began to assemble a possible timeline. I contributed pieces of memory, she with logic and objectivity. With each step, it became clearer that we were dealing with something much bigger than two old ladies rummaging through old papers in the kitchen. We were reconstructing a forgotten crime. For a moment, I doubted whether I should continue. The feeling of touching something dangerous was stronger and stronger. But Becca put her hand on mine and said, "Helen, they underestimate you because you believe you can't do anything anymore. But you can still." That phrase entered me like a bitter medicine, stirring up places I had been ignoring for years. We decided to look for old records the next day. Becca said that knowing what is missing is as important as knowing what is present. And she was right. The missing piece of confession was now the center of it all, the key that could shed light on why my son, so many years later, wanted to shut me up. When she left, I stared at the empty envelope, like someone who faces a precipice before jumping. I didn't know where that search would take us, but I knew I couldn't go back. The truth was there, hidden somewhere, waiting for someone to have the courage to pull the thread. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that maybe that someone was me. Daniel showed up at my door early the next morning, before I had even taken my first sip of coffee. It didn't hit, he went in. As if that was still his home, as if I were an inconvenient guest living in a space he had the right to manage. The sound of the door slamming behind him made my stomach twitch. He came pacing across the room with firm steps, his face tense, his breath short. He seemed like a man haunted by his own past. "Where's the envelope, Mom?" he asked bluntly. The tone was not one of concern, it was one of threat. That man wasn't the boy in the picture, he wasn't the teenager I helped through emotional storms. It was someone I didn't recognize. I pretended to be calm, even though my hands trembled. I asked him what he was talking about, trying to sound confused, the same confusion he had always used against me. His expression hardened. The lawyer told me that he gave you documents by mistake. Where is it, Mom? I know you caught it. The word caught sounded like stole. As if I were a criminal hiding evidence. Instead of answering, I offered coffee. He refused impatiently. He repeated the question, this time more aggressive. Fear took shape within me, but there was also a new feeling, something I had never directed at him, indignation. It was as if, for the first time, I was seeing Daniel without the filters of a mother, just as a man willing to destroy me. He began to search the room, pulling drawers, lifting objects, as if he had the right to turn my life upside down. I asked him to stop, but my voice came out weak. He didn't listen to me. He was upset. You have no idea what you're messing with, Mom. That's not something for you. The "for you" hit me like an insult, as if I were too fragile to deal with the truth. I followed his every move with my heart racing, fearing that I would find the drawer locked. But, luckily, or perhaps by irony of fate, he never had the patience to pay attention to details of the house. The keys were hidden behind an old porcelain jar, and Daniel walked right past it without realizing it. Before leaving, he approached me with his face a few centimeters away. If you knew what I'm trying to avoid, you'd be on my side. It was almost a request, almost a despair, but also a confession that there was something very serious behind everything. Something he couldn't let come to light. Something that justified, for him, sacrificing me in the process. When he finally left, my house smelled of expensive perfume and panic. I sat in the armchair, trying to understand the extent of that behavior. Daniel wasn't just worried, he was desperate. And someone desperate with the past is capable of anything in the present. It was at that moment that I realized, with a lump in my throat, that my son was not trying to protect me from anything. He was trying to protect himself from me. If you want to follow how far this truth will lead Helen, and how the silent war against her own son will end, subscribe to the channel. Stories like this you can only find here. Becca arrived shortly after Daniel's departure, and the first thing she noticed was the state of the room. Drawers open, objects out of place, the air still heavy with the tension he left behind. I told her everything, detail by detail, and as I spoke, her face changed from worry to firm certainty. Something was very wrong. She insisted that we should begin our search immediately, before Daniel took more drastic measures. We took the papers, wrote down the dates that appeared in the incomplete confession and decided to go after old records from the city newspaper. It was a beginning, but it was also a door that I never had the courage to open. When I arrived at the public library, I felt a strange twinge in my chest. It had been years since I had set foot there. The smell of paper and dust brought back memories of when I took little Daniel to research schoolwork. He always liked history, perhaps because it could shape his own the way he wanted. Becca asked for newspaper archives from 20-something years ago. As she talked to the librarian, I found myself staring at the walls covered in old paintings, yellowed photos, headlines of tragedies and celebrations. Somewhere inside was the truth I had never sought. We received boxes with old editions and began to leaf through them carefully. The pages were fragile like dry autumn leaves. With each date approaching the night mentioned in confession, my heart raced. I was stirring the past with my bare hands, like someone who rummages through old land in search of bones. After almost an hour, Becca called my name in a low but tense voice. The headline of the newspaper was in front of her, "Accident on a rural road leaves one dead." My whole body shivered. The date coincided with the confession. The victim's name was the same as mentioned, and what took my breath away the most was the last line of the article. The only testimony available is from a young man from the Miller family, who preferred not to be identified. My heart stopped for a moment. Daniel. It could only be him. Becca continued reading, trying to extract every shred of information. The article was short, full of gaps, as if someone had pressured it to be so. That confirmed that there was more to that story than accident and coincidence. The silence that the article suggested was as deafening as a confession. As we put the boxes back in place, I felt a devastating mixture of sadness and clarity. I loved my son, but loving him didn't stop me from seeing the obvious. He had spent his life carrying a secret. And now he wanted me to carry the weight of silence with him, even if it cost me my freedom. I left the library feeling the icy wind hit my face. It was as if the world was trying to keep me awake for what was to come next. And at that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The past was alive, running beside me like an ancient shadow. And I was finally ready to follow him to the end. In the days that followed, I realized that the house looked different. It was not only the confusion left by Daniel, it was something more subtle, more disturbing. Some objects were not where I had left them. A key disappeared from my keychain. The television turned on by itself in the middle of the night. Little things that could pass for an old woman's distraction, exactly what Daniel wanted everyone to believe. I tried to stay calm, but the fear began to spread over me like spilled paint. I observed everything more carefully, wrote down details, made appointments. If I was really being sabotaged, I wanted proof. I wanted something concrete, something that would show me that I wasn't imagining things. After all, when the family calls you confused for so long, you start to doubt even the force you use to open a door. One of the neighbors commented to me at the gate that Daniel had asked if I was in my head. He smiled as if he was helping, but I saw in his eyes the discomfort of someone who was already beginning to believe in the wrong narrative. This is exactly how an interdiction begins, by the people around you believing that you are losing control. And, little by little, I realized that Daniel was building this image perfectly. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard light footsteps in the backyard. They weren't cats or thumping branches, they were human footsteps. I stood still, feeling my heart beat against my rib as if it wanted to escape from my body. I got up slowly, walked to the window, and opened the curtain just enough to see a shadow drifting away through the side gate. The same shadow that could only have one owner. The next day, Becca came to visit me again. She noticed my tired look, the way my hands moved restlessly. I told her about the steps, about the objects out of place, and she didn't doubt me for a second. "Helen, he's trying to destabilize you. This is tactics. You need to document everything." And that's what we started to do. We spent the afternoon creating a kind of dossier, dates, times, small incidents, suspicious behavior of Daniel and his wife. It was almost like putting together a war map. And in a way, that's exactly what was happening, a quiet, calculated war where I was seen as the weakest victim, but with a powerful weapon in my hands. When Becca left, I sat in the living room with the lights on, looking at every corner of my own house as if it were enemy territory. The feeling of invasion, literal and psychological, consumed me. I was a 71-year-old woman trying to survive a battle I didn't ask to fight, but now had an obligation to win. And, for the first time, fear is no longer just fear. It became fuel. It turned into indignation. It became the will to resist until the end. That night, before going to sleep, I went to the locked drawer and touched the envelope. I could be watched, manipulated, pressured. But she was not defeated. Daniel might have had the youth, strength, and arrogance of the world, but I had something more powerful. I had the truth. And she was more and more willing to use it. It was the daughter-in-law who appeared first, in the early afternoon. He did not knock at the door as Daniel did. He stood at the gate, holding his bag to his chest, as if afraid to enter. Her expression was not arrogant or superior as always. Broken. As if something inside her had finally cracked. When I invited her in, she hesitated a little before crossing the door. He walked slowly across the room, looking around as if it were forbidden territory. He sat on the edge of his chair, his hands trembling, and when he finally looked up at me, I realized that something serious was about to come out of his mouth. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, Helen," she said, her voice breaking. The name without "ma'am" said it all. She was not there as an enemy. He was there as someone on the verge of collapse. I kept silent, waiting. And the wait was short. She began to talk about Daniel's behavior, the nights he woke up sweating, the nightmares he never explained, the strange contacts he had been avoiding. Gradually, she revealed what she feared most. He had overheard, years ago, a conversation between Daniel and someone he never identified. In this conversation, Daniel said that he couldn't let the truth come back, that everything depended on what his mother remembered. At the time, she didn't understand anything. But now, with the interdiction process, everything made too much sense. The revelation struck me like a cold wind. It wasn't just Daniel trying to silence me, he had been consumed by this secret for decades. And somehow, his wife had carried some of that weight, even without fully understanding it. Her betrayal, deep down, had been to obey her husband, to help in the process, to doubt me. But now she was breaking that loyalty. She then paused for a long time before letting out the sentence that chilled me. "Helen, what happened that night was not an accident. And Daniel knows that you were the only person who saw something. He's afraid you'll remember." I felt the ground disappear under my feet. I? Witness? I never considered myself part of that. But at that moment, loose images came back to my mind, muffled screams, lights in the hallway, a smell of smoke and damp earth. I tried to put the pieces together, but they were still scattered like a puzzle with no edges. The daughter-in-law continued, saying that Daniel feared that, with age, I would begin to speak without filters, to mix memories, to let slip what was hidden. That's why he needed to control me. That's why I needed to shut up before it was too late. As she spoke, I felt a mixture of hatred and pity. Sorry for the woman who lived next to him without knowing the truth. Hatred for having contributed, even unintentionally, to drag me into this trap. But most of all, there was a new clarity. Daniel wasn't trying to protect me from anything. He was trying to protect himself from me, and from the past that I, perhaps without realizing it, had kept alone all these years. When she finally got up to leave, I noticed her crying silently. I didn't console her. And she did not ask for consolation. It was too late for that. He just opened the door and, before crossing it, said, "Look for what is missing. The lost page." She's what he fears the most. When the door closed behind her, I felt a different weight in the air. It was not fear. It was purpose. Now I knew exactly where to go. My daughter-in-law's revelation reverberated in my head for hours, as if someone had slammed a spoon against a crystal goblet repeatedly. The lost page. That leaf torn out with almost surgical precision now had a much greater, almost frightening meaning. I needed to find it, no matter who was trying to hide it. The truth could no longer remain buried. I spent the afternoon rummaging through old boxes in the garage, boxes that I boxed up myself 20 years ago, when I reorganized the house after my husband's death. Inside, I found yellowed papers, photos, receipts that were no longer useful for anything, but also fragments of memories that I had left untouched. Each item seemed to carry a weight that pulled me back to a past that was now becoming urgent. As I fiddled with the boxes, I felt a memory slowly emerge, like a Polaroid revealing an image. I remembered an old family friend, Evelyn, a reserved, silent woman, who always showed up when something serious happened. I remembered her giving me a strange hug at my husband's wake, something too short, too contained. I also remembered that she kept documents, for safety, at someone's request. This piece, which had previously seemed irrelevant, now made sense. I called Evelyn without knowing if she still lived at the same address. His voice came out hoarse, aged, but still firm enough to recognize me immediately. He did not want to talk about details on the phone. I just asked to visit her. Her hesitation before accepting the visit revealed more than any words. Anyone who hesitates in front of an old friend who just wants to talk has something in store, and probably something I needed to know. I arrived at her house in the late afternoon, and she greeted me with an expression that mixed guilt and relief. We walked in and sat in his quiet room, which smelled of mold and apple tea. When I mentioned the confession and the missing page, she paled. She looked at me as if she had been caught red-handed. It was then that she got up without saying a word and disappeared into the room. The silence of the house seemed to stretch for endless minutes, until she returned holding a thin briefcase, wrapped in a faded fabric. He placed it on the table between us with trembling hands. "I kept it," she said, "because I was asked. They said it would be better for you, Helen. That you couldn't bear to know the whole truth." I felt the world getting heavier around me. I opened the folder carefully, as if opening a sacred document, and there it was, the lost page. The handwriting was the same as the others, the words intense, loaded with guilt and fear. And in that final stretch, I discovered what was missing: the full name of the person responsible for the accident, and confirmation that someone had helped cover it all up. My son's name was there, written without hesitation, along with a detailed description of what he had done. But there was more. The confession was not Daniel's. It was his father's. He took the blame for having asked his own teenage son to lie to protect him. It hit me like a storm. Everything was connected: the accident, the confession, the guilt that Daniel carried alone for years. And I, who thought I knew my family, realized that I never really knew anyone. I put the page away with steady hands. The truth was even more devastating than I imagined, but now I had all the pieces. And with them, I would face Daniel, and the whole world, if necessary. I returned home with the lost page hidden in my coat pocket, feeling like I was carrying a piece of history that was about to explode. As soon as I arrived, I called Becca, who came immediately, bringing with her enough courage for both of us. We talked at the kitchen table, with the open briefcase between us, while the sky outside slowly darkened. She read the entire page, unblinking, absorbing every word. When he finished, he carefully left the sheet on the table, as if he were returning a bomb without a pin. "Helen, it changes everything." She was right. It wasn't just about Daniel forbidding me, it was about the burden he'd carried since he was a boy, placed on his shoulders by his own father. His fear now made sense. But nothing justified destroying me to hide it. We started planning the hearing. Becca organized the documents in chronological order, wrote down key points, formulated questions and possible answers. I watched, impressed by her skill, and grateful. I don't know what would have become of me without that woman by my side. For the first time, I felt I had a real chance of winning. At the same time, I felt a new strength born within me. The Helen that Daniel tried to paint as incapable no longer existed. I saw it in the way my hands no longer trembled, in the firmness with which I faced each document, each detail. I was recognizing myself again, not as the docile, submissive mother who accepted everything, but as the whole woman I had been before life wore me down. In the following days, I prepared myself as if I were training for a fight. I studied, revised, understood every part of the confession. I reviewed memories of the night of the accident, looking for fragments that, until then, I had buried for self-preservation. Gradually, everything began to fall into place: every strange gesture of Daniel's, every silence, every look that hid something. And then came the day I received the official notification of the hearing. The paper was clean, serious, loaded with formality. I smiled as I held it, because now that document didn't scare me. It had become the stage where I would finally have a voice, and where Daniel would have to face what he had done to me and himself for so many years. The night before the hearing, I sat in the dark room, with only a lamp on, holding the lost page between my fingers. I thought about my husband, my son, the silence that had sickened my family for decades. I also thought of Helen, the woman I had always been, and who was now reborn, stronger than I had ever imagined. When I closed my eyes to sleep, I felt no fear. I felt purpose. I felt strength. I felt that, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't being carried away by the current. I was choosing to swim. The day of the hearing arrived with a different silence, heavy, almost respectful. I woke up before the alarm clock, even though I had not set it. My body knew that this was no ordinary day. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple but firm outfit, as I wanted to feel, no delicate prints, nothing that screamed fragility. I looked in the mirror and, for a moment, I didn't see just an old woman. I saw a woman ready to fight. Becca arrived early, holding a neat briefcase and a strong coffee for me. She spoke little, as if she knew it was not time to waste energy. In the car, on the way to the courthouse, I watched the city through the glass, streets I had always known, houses that saw Daniel grow up, people who now probably heard rumors about my confusion. I took a deep breath. It was there that story would be rewritten, in front of everyone who thought they already knew the ending. As I entered the courtroom, I felt all eyes rest on me. Daniel was already there, in a dark suit, next to the lawyer. He didn't look directly at me, he would fixate on some point on the table, as if I were just an administrative problem. However, his tense jaw and clenched hands betrayed the storm within. On the other side, I sat next to Becca, who placed her hand on mine in silence. The judge entered, formal, distant, but I knew that, for him, all this was just another process. For me, it was my life being measured in words, reports, and dubious looks. Daniel's lawyer began by speaking, painting a careful version of me, a lady, increasingly forgotten, with episodes of confusion, at risk of hurting herself. Every sentence was a stab, but I remained quiet. Then they began to cite small incidents out of context, a bill paid twice, a pan forgotten on the fire, a day when I couldn't remember where I had put my glasses. Ordinary things, inflated as proof that I was no longer in control of my own life. I looked at Daniel and saw that he avoided my gaze. Perhaps because he knew that if he stared at me, he would see the mother he was trying to bury alive. When it was my turn to speak, the room seemed to get smaller. The walls seemed to get closer as I stood up. My voice came out firm, more than I expected. I told them about my daily life, my routines, my memories. I didn't try to pretend perfection, I admitted my forgetfulness, but I made it clear that it didn't make me incapable. And then I mentioned the envelope. I saw Daniel's lawyer move in his chair. The tension grew when I said that, by mistake, I was handed a document that should not have reached my hands. I looked directly at the judge and explained that document concerned an old crime, linked to my family, and that I had reason to believe that the interdiction process was directly linked to the attempt to hide this truth. When I presented the confession and the lost page, the room seemed to swallow the air at once. The judge asked to see the documents. Daniel's lawyer, pale, tried to argue that it was irrelevant to the sanity of the respondent, but the connection was too obvious to ignore. The judge decided to read the main passages right there. Every word that came out of his mouth seemed to tear off masks. That's when Daniel finally lost control. He stood up, nervous, saying that it was an invasion, that I had no right to expose the memory of his father in that way. His voice cracked, his eyes shining with anger and fear. The judge ordered him to sit down, but Daniel ignored it, saying disconnected things, trying to justify the unjustifiable. And, without realizing it, he ended up confirming much more than he denied. In that instant, everyone in the room saw what I already knew. I wasn't the out-of-control person there. He was. When the hearing came to an end, I already knew, even before the judge spoke, that something had changed. This was no longer a simple case of a confused old lady. It was a picture of abuse, manipulation, and forced silence. I didn't know yet what the final decision would be, but one thing was clear, my voice had been heard. And at that moment, this was already a victory. The decision came a few hours later, in a new call to the room. I walked lighter this time, as if some of the weight had already been left behind. The judge spoke with the usual formality, but each word seemed like a brick being removed from the wall that surrounded me. The request for interdiction was denied. My ability was recognized. I would not be deprived of my home, my freedom, my own history. As he read the decision, I observed Daniel for the first time with a mixture of pain and liberation. He was dejected, defeated, his gaze fixed somewhere between the ground and the chasm that now opened up beneath his feet. I still loved him, that I couldn't deny, but that love had taken on a bittersweet, irretrievable color. It was the love for a son who chose to put me as an enemy to avoid facing his own past. In addition to denying the interdiction, the judge determined that the content of the confession be forwarded to the competent authorities for investigation. My husband's name, the accident, the testimony of the unidentified young man, all of these would now be revisited in another light. I felt that, somewhere, the past was stirring in the grave, uncomfortable for having been disturbed. But I didn't regret it. The silence had already caused too much damage. I left the forum with Becca by my side. The air outside felt cooler, as if I had spent hours underwater and only now returned to the surface. Some people looked at me with curiosity, others with respect, still others with that silent judgment that always accompanies family scandals. But none of that mattered as much as the feeling of being whole again. Daniel approached me from the outside. For a second, I saw the boy he once was, lost, scared. His lips moved as if he were going to say something, maybe an apology, maybe a new attempt at justification. But the words did not come out. All he could do was shake his head in denial before turning around and walking away. I didn't try to call him. The bridge between us was burnt out, and I didn't know if I would ever have the strength to rebuild it. In the days that followed, the house would look different. Not because the furniture had moved around, but because I had moved myself. The old woman who walked through the rooms afraid of being considered crazy no longer existed. In his place walked a woman who faced a court, a child, an entire past, and came out standing. I started doing little things for myself. I tidied up the garden that was abandoned, threw away papers that were no longer useful, donated clothes that did not represent me. I went out to walk around the neighborhood without lowering my eyes, greeting people who had previously looked at me with pity. Now, some looked at me with a kind of curious respect, as if they had discovered that I was stronger than I would appear at first glance. Becca continued to be present, no longer as a simple neighbor, but as a friend who saw the worst version of me and stayed. Sometimes we sat on the porch, drinking coffee and talking about everything but lawsuits and confessions. Other times, she encouraged me to think about the future, about projects, about things I always wanted to do, and I postponed it because of my family. For the first time, I began to imagine a life not built around being someone's mother. At night, there were still times when pain visited me. I thought of Daniel as a child, of the laughter shared, of the stories told before bed. It hurt to know that this boy had grown up and made such hard choices. But along with the pain, there was also a quiet relief. I was no longer living a lie. Truth, bitter as it was still a kind of freedom. One night, I sat in the living room with the lights off, only the faint glow coming from the street. I looked at Daniel's picture frame and left there, in silence, a farewell that needed no words. It was not a definitive goodbye, but it was the recognition that our relationship would never be what it was. Maybe, one day, he would come back in a different way. Maybe not. I couldn't control it. What I could control, in short, was my own life. And, after so long being treated as a supporting actor that it could be erased with a byline, I had regained the lead role. The days passed with a new silence, not the silence that oppresses, but the silence that allows us to breathe. For the first time in many years, I woke up feeling that the house was truly mine, not a place where I just existed while others decided my fate. I walked through the rooms with another posture, another presence. It was as if, by surviving that storm, I had regained something I didn't even know I had lost, my own dignity. The garden, which once reflected my emotional abandonment, was the first to be reborn with me. I spent entire mornings pruning, fertilizing, replanting flowers that I always admired, but never had the courage to take care of. It was almost therapeutic to see life emerging in spaces where before there were only dry leaves. Sometimes, neighbors would pass by and greet me with a silent respect, different from the look of pity they had carried weeks before. Becca continued to be my constant presence, but now in a lighter way. He came to have coffee, talk about trivialities, laugh at nonsense. We talked about the audience only when necessary. The truth had been told, and now it belonged to the past. She encouraged me to start something new, something that was just mine. And that's how I decided to set up a small greenhouse in the backyard, where I could grow herbs and flowers to sell at the local market. It wasn't about making money. It was about reminding myself that I could still create, build, be useful. The feeling of independence grew with each seed I planted. And deep down, I knew that this little greenhouse represented more than a hobby. It was a symbol of rebirth, a silent response to the attempt to erase me. About Daniel. The silence between us has become a strange but necessary space. He didn't try to visit me. He didn't care. He didn't send a message. And I didn't look for him. There was an open, deep, still pulsating wound. Part of me lamented what we lost, what he became, what I never knew. But another part, the part that now breathed without fear, knew that some distances are necessary for emotional survival. Some nights, when the wind blows through the branches of the trees, I think of the boy he was and the silent tragedy that shaped his life. I don't hate him. I don't know if I will ever be able to forgive him completely. But I learned that not every mother needs to carry the world on her back. Sometimes, loving also means moving away so as not to die of suffocation. The city, which once seemed too small for so much secrecy, gradually became just a setting for my daily walks. I smiled more. He breathed better. And I felt stronger than I ever imagined I could. The Helen who entered that process was a woman diminished by fear. The Helen that came out of it was steel, bent, but not broken. One day, I received an anonymous letter. The envelope was simple, with no sender. Inside, only one sentence: "What you discovered was only the surface." There was no signature, but the warning echoed within me as a warning and a promise. For a few moments, my heart raced, as if a new story was preparing to begin. But, unlike what would have happened weeks before, I didn't feel afraid. I put the letter in a drawer, closed it, and went back to my garden. Life, after all, keeps growing even when the past tries to pull it down. And I had decided to continue growing with her. As I watered the flowers, I felt the sun warm my shoulders. It was a simple but deep warmth, like an armless embrace. There, in that backyard full of colors, I understood something I had never really understood. I didn't need to go back to who I was before all this. I needed to be who I became later. And for the first time in many years, that was more than enough. Now I want to know from you, what shocked you the most about this story? Did you think Helen was right to reveal everything, even though she knew she could destroy her own son? Comment below. Your opinion makes all the difference and helps bring even more exciting stories like this to the channel.